Let's talk about the growth paradox and the architecture of enough. I've been thinking lately how we as a global society are currently trying to fly a plane while simultaneously trying to change its engine, swap out the fuel, and most importantly, ignore the fact that the cabin is getting increasingly heavy. In the world of climate policy, we have these things called IAMs, integrated assessment models, and they are essentially the flight simulator for our future. But there's a strange default setting in almost every single one of them. The assumption that the plane must keep getting bigger. That economic growth is not just a feature, but a non-negotiable requirement for human happiness. But what if that very assumption is the weight that brings the plane down? To be honest with you, for a very long time I wanted to believe in green growth. I wanted to believe that we can maintain our lifestyle, the way we do things, the way we navigate life, and just manage to get it all powered by sunbeams and wind somehow. And that's because it's a really comfortable story. It does require very little labor of ourselves. But then, of course, through my work over the years, I've become a lot more skeptical of that. And then this week I sat down with a new research paper by Aljoša Slameršak et al. And it forced me to look at my misunderstanding and the whole prequel to our climate plans. Because the researchers pointed out that our current models rely on technological miracles that haven't happened yet. All of that to protect a version of growth that most of us aren't actually benefiting from anymore. And to understand this paper, we need to look at the metabolic paradox. So imagine a professional athlete who is addicted to performance-enhancing supplements. And to keep their speed up, they have to take more and more. But the supplements are starting to wreck their liver and inflame their joints. And here the mainstream approach says, well, just keep the supplements, but let's find a lab that's cleaner in making them. Here on the other hand, the post-growth approach says, maybe the goal isn't to have bigger muscles at any cost. Maybe the goal is long-term health and vitality. And the paper does reveal a staggering statistic. 70% of our global energy expenditure, which is about 290 exajoules per year, goes towards what they call less necessary consumption. And only 30% goes to the muscles of society, like housing and food and healthcare and basic mobility. So we are currently overfeeding the growth inflammation, while 1 billion people are still undernourished in terms of basic energy needs. We are using 12 to 14 calories of fossil fuel energy to deliver 1 calorie of food. And we're doing the same thing with our lives. We are burning massive amounts of planetary capital for well-being returns that are increasingly marginal. And in this paper, the researchers introduced a concept that I think we need to burn into our minds. The safe and just corridor. They don't just talk about poverty, no, they talk about the opposite, they talk about sufficiency. The floor here is the decent living standard. And that means the energy required for a warm home, clean water, education, and connection. And the ceiling are the ecological limits of our biosphere. And the paper argues that we actually have a massive amount of decent living headroom. We could actually provide a high quality of life for everyone on Earth, using less than half of the energy we use today. But to get there, we have to address the growth inflation. And by that they mean the SUVs, the frequent flying of the top 1%, and the planned obsolescence of our gadgets. So how do we apply this? How do we stop swimming in the current of infinite growth? So the paper actually suggests 5 principles. And these are aimed to bridge the gap between our current growth addiction and a stable, high well-being future. So in our current system, we use GDP as a measure of success. If the number goes up, we're told we're doing well. But as the paper points out, GDP only measures the speed of the hamster wheel. It doesn't measure the health of the hamster. So the first pillar is well-being. And the logic here is that this principle shifts to a needs sufficiency framework. It defines well-being as finite and satiable. And it covers things like healthcare, education, and autonomy. And it doesn't cover unlimited wants. The goal here is to distinguish between production that actually nourishes human life and production that just generates utility for mindless consumption. Pillar number 2 is sufficiency. And that is probably the most radical concept in the paper. It suggests that there is a sweet spot for human existence, the safe and just corridor. with the floor being the absolute minimum energy and materials for a decent living standard, and the ceiling being the biophysical limits of the planet, so the planetary boundaries. Pillar number 3 is reduced inequality. Because the paper is planned, we cannot stay within planetary boundaries if the top 1% consumes 8 times more than the bottom 10% in the north and 40 times more than the global south. And this isn't just about income, this is about fair energy ratios. The researchers suggest a ratio of roughly 5:1 between the wealthiest and the poorest. And by capping the excess of the ultra wealthy, we free up the atmospheric space for the rest of humanity to reach a decent floor. Number 4 is then about repurposing the economy. Because post-growth isn't about shrinking everything, it's about selective metabolism. What should shrink are destructive and positional sectors. Think military spending, industrial meat, fast fashion, and the advertising industry. And what should grow? Well, socially necessary sectors, such as renewable energy, public transit, repair services, and the care economy. And the logic here is that we stop optimizing for profit margins and start optimizing for service provision efficiency. And the principle, or the pillar number 5, is north-south convergence. This principle acknowledges the carbon pulse history. High-income countries have already used more than their fair share of the carbon pie. So the global north must intentionally scale down its aggregate resource use, and that would be degrowth, to allow the global south to scale up their infrastructure and development. And this would require reparations and an end to the unequal exchange, where the south provides cheap labor and materials to fuel the north's growth. And to make those 5 principles work, the paper suggests 2 gears: decommodification and growth-independent innovation. Decommodification would mean that we move basic needs like housing and water out of the market. Because if you don't have to earn a massive salary just to survive, you gain the agency to work less and also to consume less. And then in terms of growth-independent innovation, designing tech that lasts forever and that is easy to fix. Because we need low throughput brilliance and not planned obsolescence cleverness. The takeaway here is that the 5 principles are a triage, if you want, for a planet in crisis. And the most uncomfortable part of this research isn't actually the math. It is the realization that the barriers to a better world aren't technological. They aren't even geophysical. No, the barriers are sociocultural. We are terrified of less because we have been told that less means worse. But Slameršak and their team show us a world where less energy use actually leads to more time, more equity, and more stability. In a world where we have been trained to be consumers first and citizens second, choosing sufficiency is an act of rebellion. It's also an expression of ethics. It is saying that my right to an SUV does not outweigh a child's right to a stable climate in the global south. So yeah, we don't need a bigger plane. We need a plane that is designed to land safely. And if you want to dive deeper into the topic, I have created a sufficiency blueprint, a post-growth action plan if you want. And you can access that in the description of this video. I will also leave a link to the paper below in the description. It is definitely worth a read and something to ponder. So, let me know what you think. Could this be bringing us closer to a sustainable global future based on sufficiency and well-being? Thank you for joining me today, and see you again soon.